Every spring, 2 billion people around the world celebrate a holiday they believe honors the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They dye eggs, they hide baskets, they dress their kids up and take them to church. But here's what almost none of them have ever been told. Over 4,000 years ago, on clay tablets buried beneath the sands of what is now Iraq, scribes carved a story about a goddess who descended into the land of the dead and came back. Her name was Inanna. The Babylonians called her Ishtar. And the rituals performed in her honor involved things that would make your skin crawl: fertility rites, ritual weeping, 40 days of fasting. And if certain historians and archaeologists are right, the sacrifice of children. The question nobody wants to answer is simple. How much of what we do every spring actually comes from the Bible? And how much of it comes from something much, much older? To understand where any of this begins, you have to go back to the oldest civilization we've ever found, Sumer, a network of city-states between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what we now call Iraq. These people didn't just invent writing. They built the first cities, the first legal codes, and the first organized religions. Or at least they were the first to write it all down. And at the center of their belief system was a goddess named Inanna. Inanna was the queen of heaven, goddess of love, sex, fertility, and war. Her symbol was the 8-pointed star, and her sacred animal was the lion. She wasn't gentle. She wasn't meek. Ancient hymns describe her stirring up chaos against anyone who disobeyed her, speeding carnage and inciting the devastating flood. Battle itself was sometimes called the Dance of Inanna. But the story that matters most for our purposes is one carved onto cuneiform tablets dating back roughly 4,000 years. It's called The Descent of Inanna, and it's one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered, older than the Odyssey by over 1,000 years. The poem tells us that Inanna decided to journey to the underworld, the land of the dead, a realm called the Great Below, ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead. Nobody knows exactly why she went. Some scholars believe she wanted to extend her power into the realm of death itself. Others think she was attending the funeral of Ereshkigal's husband, Gugalanna, the Bull of Heaven. But whatever her motive, what happened to her down there changed the course of religious history. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna was forced to remove one piece of her royal clothing, her crown at the first gate, her necklace of lapis lazuli at the second, her breastplate at the third, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her garment. By the time she passed through the 7th gate and entered her sister's throne room, she was completely naked, completely stripped of every symbol of power she had ever held. Ereshkigal looked at her sister, and she killed her. The ancient texts say she fixed the eye of death upon Inanna, spoke the word of death against her, and turned her into a corpse. Then she hung that corpse on a hook on the wall. But that wasn't the end. Before descending, Inanna had given instructions to her faithful servant Ninshuber. If I don't return in 3 days, go to the gods and beg for help. So Ninshuber did. She went first to the god Enlil. He refused. She went to the moon god Nanna. He refused. Finally, she reached Enki, the god of wisdom, and Enki agreed to help. He created 2 small beings, neither male nor female, and sent them into the underworld carrying the food and water of life. They found Inanna's body, sprinkled the food and water of life upon it, and she was resurrected. She rose from the dead. But there was a catch. The underworld has rules. You can't just walk out of the land of the dead. Someone has to take your place. When Inanna returned to the world above, demons followed close behind, ready to drag someone back in her place. They traveled from city to city, and at each stop Inanna saw people mourning her absence, weeping for their lost queen. She spared every one of them. Then she arrived home, and she found her husband, Dumuzid, sitting on her throne, dressed in magnificent garments, showing not a single sign of grief over her death. He hadn't mourned her at all. Inanna was furious. She gave him what the ancient texts call the Eye of Death and pointed at him. Take him, she told the demons. He is my replacement. The demons seized Dumuzid. He cried out to the sun god Utu to save him, and was briefly transformed into a snake to escape. But the demons caught him again. He was dragged into the underworld. Eventually, a deal was struck. Dumuzid's sister Gishtanana volunteered to take his place for half the year, so Dumuzid would spend 6 months in the land of the dead and 6 months in the world above. And this cycle, according to the Sumerians, explained the changing of the seasons. When Dumuzid was below, the land dried up. The crops withered. The heat of summer scorched the earth. When he returned, life came back. Green things grew again. Now here's where it connects. When the Akkadians built their empire and absorbed Sumerian religion, Inanna became Ishtar, and Dumuzid became Tammuz. The same story survived, just with different names. And the mourning for Tammuz, the weeping for the dead god who would eventually return, became one of the most widespread religious rituals in the ancient Near East. It didn't stay in Mesopotamia. The myth traveled. And everywhere it went, it changed shape, but kept its bones. In Egypt, the dying and rising god took the form of Osiris. And his story, while different in its details, follows the same deep pattern. Osiris was a primeval king of Egypt, a good ruler, beloved by his people. But his brother Set was consumed with jealousy. According to the Greek writer Plutarch, who compiled the fullest surviving version of the myth, Set tricked Osiris into climbing into a decorated chest at a banquet. The moment Osiris lay down inside, Set slammed the lid shut, sealed it with lead, and threw it into the Nile. The chest drifted out to sea and eventually washed ashore near the Phoenician city of Byblos, where a great tree grew around it, absorbing the chest into its trunk. The tree was so magnificent that the king of Byblos had it cut down and used as a pillar in his palace, with Osiris still entombed inside. Isis, the devoted wife of Osiris, searched the world for her husband's body. She finally tracked it to Byblos, recovered the chest, and brought it back to Egypt. But Set found the body again. And this time, he tore Osiris into 14 pieces and scattered them across the land. Isis, in one of the most tenacious acts of devotion in all of mythology, traveled through Egypt and recovered 13 of the 14 pieces. She reassembled her husband's body, wrapped it in linen, and, with the help of the gods, briefly brought him back to life, long enough, according to the myth, to conceive their son Horus. But Osiris could not remain among the living. He descended into the underworld and became its lord, the god of the dead, the judge of souls, and crucially, the god of the Nile's annual flooding, which brought fertility back to the land, and the god of agricultural cycles, the death and rebirth of crops that sustained Egyptian civilization. His influence on Egyptian culture was enormous. The pyramid texts, dating back to around 2400 BC, describe rituals designed to help the dead pharaoh follow in the footsteps of Osiris and achieve resurrection in the afterlife. By the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 BC, this privilege had been democratized. Ordinary Egyptians began to believe that they too could achieve eternal life by following Osiris's example. Mummification practices were modeled directly on what Isis had done for her husband's body. The wrapping of the dead in linen, the preservation of the flesh, the placement of amulets and sacred texts, all of it was an attempt to replicate Osiris's resurrection in the body of every deceased person. The Book of the Dead, which guided souls through the underworld, explicitly invoked Osiris and promised the righteous that they would live again just as he had. Egyptian tombs were decorated with images of Osiris sprouting grain from his body, a visual metaphor so blunt it almost doesn't need explaining. The dead god produces life. Death feeds the harvest. The cycle continues. The parallels to Tammuz are obvious. A god who dies. A goddess who mourns him and seeks his return. A resurrection that is tied to the cycles of nature. The death of vegetation and its renewal. Scholars like Sir James Fraser, writing in The Golden Bough, put it plainly. Under the names of Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, and Attis, the peoples of Egypt and Western Asia represented the yearly decay and revival of life, which they personified as a god who annually died and rose again from the dead. In name and detail, the rites varied from place to place. In substance, they were the same. And in Greece, the myth surfaced yet again. Ishtar became Aphrodite. Tammuz became Adonis, a name that literally comes from the Canaanite word Adon, meaning my lord. According to the myth, the infant Adonis was so beautiful that Aphrodite hid him in a chest and gave him to Persephone, queen of the underworld, for safekeeping. But Persephone opened the chest, fell in love with the child herself, and refused to give him back. The gods had to intervene. Zeus decreed that Adonis would spend 4 months with Persephone in the underworld, 4 months with Aphrodite in the world above, and 4 months wherever he chose. He chose Aphrodite, but eventually Adonis was killed by a wild boar. Some versions say the boar was sent by Eris, the god of war, out of jealousy. Where Adonis's blood fell, red anemone flowers sprang from the earth. Every year, the women of Greece mourned Adonis with ritual weeping and planted gardens of Adonis, shallow containers of quick-growing plants that would sprout rapidly and then wither and die, symbolizing the god's brief, beautiful life. They would set these gardens adrift on the sea or in rivers, watching the dying plants float away. The festival called the Adonia was one of the most popular in the Greek world. The 7th century BC poet Sappho wrote about it. Plato mentioned it. It was celebrated in Athens, in Alexandria, in the Greek colonies across the Mediterranean. And scholars have traced the Adonia directly back to the Mesopotamian mourning rituals for Tammuz. The pattern is everywhere. A god dies. A goddess mourns. The god returns. And the earth comes back to life. And it didn't stop in Greece. In what is now Turkey, the cult of Attis and the Great Mother Cybele told yet another version of the same story. Attis was a beautiful young shepherd god, beloved by the mother goddess Cybele. He was killed, depending on which version you follow, either by a wild boar or by his own hand after being driven mad. Pine trees and violets supposedly sprang from his blood, and every spring his worshippers held a festival in his honor. The Roman author Firmicus Maternus described the Attis festival in detail. On the first day, a pine tree was cut down and brought into the sanctuary of Cybele, wrapped in linen like a corpse. For 2 days, worshippers mourned. They fasted. They wept. Priests called the galley would wound themselves in a frenzy of grief. And then, on the 3rd day, came the Hilaria, the day of joy. Attis had risen. The mourning was over. The worshippers erupted in celebration, feasting and dancing in the streets. The 3rd day. The god dies, is mourned, and on the 3rd day, rises again. And this festival was celebrated in Rome itself every year from March 15th through March 28th, with the resurrection of Attis falling on March 25th. This timing placed it directly alongside the spring equinox and eventually directly alongside the Christian celebration of Easter. The Roman calendar literally had a death and resurrection festival running at the same time every year, in the same city where the early church was establishing its authority. The overlap wasn't subtle, so by the time Christianity began spreading through the Roman Empire, the idea of a god who dies and rises again in the spring wasn't new. It wasn't radical. It was the most familiar religious concept in the ancient world. Every major civilization had some version of it. The only question was which god's resurrection you were celebrating. And according to the Bible itself, this pattern reached Jerusalem. The Book of Ezekiel, chapter 8, contains one of the most disturbing visions in the entire Old Testament. The prophet Ezekiel is given a supernatural tour of the temple in Jerusalem, and God shows him the abominations being committed by the people of Israel. What he sees gets progressively worse as they go deeper into the temple complex. And then in verse 14, they arrive at the north gate. And this is what the text says. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. There it is, right in the Bible. The people of Israel, at the very gates of the temple of God, performing the mourning ritual of a Babylonian deity. The same ritual that commemorated the death and return of Dumuzid. The same cycle of death and resurrection that began in Sumer over 1,000 years before. God's response, according to Ezekiel, was not gentle. He called it an abomination. And the chapter goes on to describe even worse things happening inside the temple, including people literally bowing down toward the east to worship the sun. Think about what that means for a second. The holiest site in the Jewish world, the temple of the living God, and people were performing pagan mourning rituals for a Mesopotamian fertility deity right at its gates. That tells you how deeply embedded these practices were. This wasn't some fringe movement. It was mainstream enough to reach the temple itself. And the mourning for Tammuz wasn't a casual observance. Historical sources tell us it lasted approximately 40 days. In ancient Mesopotamia, sacred marriage rites were conducted in the spring to ensure Tammuz's presence in the fertility of the earth and of livestock. Priests and priestesses participated in elaborate ceremonies. And when the dry heat of summer arrived and the vegetation withered, it was interpreted as Tammuz's departure to the underworld. His worshippers wept for him, fasted for him, and waited for his return. The 4th month of the Hebrew calendar is still called Tammuz to this day. Think about that. Thousands of years after the Babylonian exile, and the name of this dying god is embedded in the Jewish calendar. The month falls around June and July, And during that time, ancient peoples across the Near East observed rituals of mourning to mark the god's descent into the land of the dead. 40 days of weeping, 40 days of abstinence, 40 days of fasting, commemorating the death of a god who would return. Sound familiar? The early Christian church didn't have a 40-day fasting period before Easter. That practice developed gradually over several centuries, but by the 4th century, a standardized 40-day Lenten period was firmly established, and historians have pointed out the uncomfortable parallel. Alexander Hislop, writing in the 1850s in his book The Two Babylons, argued that the Catholic practice of Lent was borrowed directly from the Babylonian mourning period for Tammuz. Now, Hislop's work is controversial. Some of his claims have been challenged by modern scholars, but the core observation that a 40-day spring fast existed in Babylon long before it appeared in Christianity is historically documented. The ancient historian Humboldt recorded that the pagan Mexicans observed a solemn 40-day fast in spring in honor of the sun. Egyptian records show a similar 40-day fast connected to the mourning for Osiris. The pattern repeats across cultures and continents. But what about the word itself? What about the name Easter? If you speak French, you don't call it Easter. You call it Pax, from the Latin Pascha, which comes from the Hebrew Pesach, meaning Passover. If you speak Italian, it's Pasqua. Spanish, Pascua. Russian, Pascha. In almost every language on earth, the celebration of Christ's resurrection is named after the Jewish Passover, because that's when the crucifixion happened. But in English and German, something different happened. In English, we call it Easter. In German, Ostern. And the reason traces back to a single paragraph written by a monk in the 8th century. His name was Bede, often called the Venerable Bede. He was an English monk and historian born in 672 AD, widely regarded as the father of English history. Around 725 AD, he wrote a book called De Temporum Ratione, which means the reckoning of time. It was essentially a guide to the calendar. In one chapter, Bede listed the Anglo-Saxon names for each month. And when he got to April, he dropped a detail that has haunted scholars for over 1,000 years. He wrote that the month was called Eostre month, named after a goddess called Eostre, in whose honor the Anglo-Saxons held feasts during that month. He then noted that the new Christian celebration of the resurrection had simply absorbed her name. The joys of the new rite, he wrote, were now called by the time-honored name of the old observance. That's it. One paragraph. One monk. One goddess. And for over 1,000 years, no other source confirmed her existence. Now, the name itself is interesting. Linguists have traced the word Eostre back to a Proto-Germanic root, ostron, meaning dawn. And that root connects to an even older word from Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of almost every European language, where the root ate to use means to shine. Follow that root across the ancient world and you find cognates everywhere. The Greek goddess Eos, the goddess of the dawn, the Roman Aurora, the Vedic goddess Ushas from ancient Hindu scripture, the Baltic goddess Osrine, the morning star goddess, all goddesses of dawn and light, all connected linguistically to the same ancient root. So whether or not there was a specific Anglo-Saxon goddess named Eostre, the linguistic evidence suggests there was a widespread Indo-European tradition of venerating the dawn, the light that returns after darkness, the moment when the world is reborn each morning. And that concept, that celebration of light returning, maps almost too perfectly onto the idea of a god who dies and comes back to life. Scholars fought about Eostre for centuries. Charles Bilson, writing in 1892, noted that academics were sharply divided. Some, like the brothers Grimm, had no doubt she was real. Jacob Grimm, in his 1835 work, Deutsche Mythology, reconstructed a continental Germanic version of the goddess he called Ostara, and argued that her worship was so deeply rooted that even the Christian teachers tolerated the name and applied it to their own grandest anniversary. Others dismissed Eostre as an etymological invention, a goddess conjured from a month name, rather than the other way around. The consensus leaned toward believing Bede, since he was born in 672 AD, during the early stages of England's Christianization, and would have had living access to people who remembered the old ways. He was a meticulous historian, not given to invention. As one scholar put it, it would be uncritical to saddle this eminent father of the church with making up a goddess. And then, in 1958, something turned up. Near a small town in Germany called Morkenharf, Archaeologists discovered over 150 votive inscriptions to a group of goddesses called the Matronae Austriaceae. These inscriptions date to around 150 to 250 AD. The root of that name, Ostra, is linguistically connected to the Old English word Eostre. It's not proof that Eostre existed exactly as Bede described her, but it is evidence that dawn or spring goddesses with similar names were worshipped in the broader Germanic world centuries before Bede was born. Now, this is where things get messy. Because every year, a viral meme makes the rounds on social media claiming that Easter is really Ishtar, that the word Easter is just a mispronunciation of Ishtar, and that eggs and bunnies were Ishtar's fertility symbols. Historians have thoroughly debunked this. Ishtar is not pronounced Easter. It's pronounced Ishtar. The word Easter comes from the Germanic language family, not from ancient Mesopotamia. Ishtar's actual symbols were the lion, the eight-pointed star, and the gate. Not eggs, not rabbits. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation so strange. Just because the viral meme gets the details wrong doesn't mean there's no connection at all. The scholarly debate isn't about whether Easter is literally named after Ishtar. It's about something deeper. It's about whether the concept of a death and resurrection celebration in spring, with its eggs and its fasting and its connection to fertility, was already embedded in human culture thousands of years before Christianity arrived. And on that question, the evidence is genuinely unsettling. Everyone knows Easter means eggs. Kids dye them. Families hide them. Churches hold egg hunts on their lawns every spring. But nobody ever stops to ask where that tradition actually comes from, because the answer isn't in the Bible. The Gospels don't mention eggs. Not once. The resurrection narratives involve a stone rolled away from a tomb, not an egg cracked open. So where did this come from? Eggs as symbols of rebirth and creation appear in mythologies all over the ancient world. The Egyptians believed the sun god Ra hatched from a primeval egg at the beginning of time. In the Vedic writings of ancient India, there is a cosmic egg, and within it lives a spirit that will be born, die, and be born yet again. Chinese legends trace the ancestry of certain peoples back to divine eggs. One myth holds that the first being, Pengu, emerged from a cosmic egg and his body became the mountains and rivers of the world. The Persians decorated eggs during their spring festival of Nowruz, a tradition that continues to this day thousands of years later. In Finland, the Kalevala describes the world being created from the fragments of a cosmic egg that fell from a duck nesting on the knee of a goddess. The symbol of the egg as a vessel of new life, as a container from which the dead can be reborn, is one of the most universal images in human religion. It predates any single faith. It predates writing itself. The Venerable Bede didn't connect Eostre to eggs. Jacob Grimm, the 19th century folklorist, didn't either. The tradition of decorated eggs at Easter appears to be a medieval Christian practice connected to Lenten fasting. Christians abstained from eating eggs during the 40 days of Lent, so when Easter arrived, they had a surplus of eggs that had been collected and decorated during the fast. That's the simple, documented explanation. But the symbolism cuts deeper, because the egg as a symbol of life emerging from apparent death goes back further than any Christian practice. It goes back to the oldest civilizations we know about. And then there's the rabbit, the Easter bunny, which again appears nowhere in the Bible. The earliest known reference to an egg-laying hare connected to Easter dates to 1682 in Germany, from a medical professor named Georg Frank von Frankenau. The tradition came to America with German immigrants in the 1700s who brought their custom of the Osterhase, the Easter hare. In 1884, a writer named H. Krebs proposed an explanation. He claimed the hare was originally a bird that the goddess Ostara had transformed into a four-legged creature, and that the hare, remembering its former life as a bird, could still lay eggs on the goddess's festival. It's a strange story, and no documented source for it exists before Krebs wrote it down. But the rabbit as a fertility symbol is ancient. Rabbits reproduce quickly. That's not mythology, that's biology. And the connection between springtime, fertility, and new life is older than any single religion. Now, I need to take you somewhere uncomfortable, because there is a claim that sounds extreme on its face, but has more archaeological backing than you might expect. The claim is that these ancient fertility religions didn't just celebrate life, they demanded it through sacrifice. In the ruins of ancient Carthage, in what is now Tunisia, archaeologists discovered a site called the Tophet. It was first uncovered in 1921 when a French archaeologist witnessed antiquities smugglers digging up inscribed stones outside the ancient city walls. He followed the trail, and what lay beneath those stones launched one of the most disturbing archaeological debates of the 20th century. What they found was a vast open-air sanctuary. Not a cemetery in the traditional sense, but something else. A sacred precinct, enclosed by walls, where for over 600 years the Carthaginians had buried small urns containing the cremated remains of infants. Over 20,000 urns in the excavated areas alone, and archaeologists believe the full site was larger than what they've been able to dig up, given that modern Carthage has been built on top of the ancient ruins. Stone markers, called stelae, stood above the urns. Many were carved with images of the gods Baal Hammon and his consort Tanit. Some showed a figure with raised hands, palms up, which some scholars interpret as a priest offering a child. Others bore the symbol of the crescent moon and sun disk, the same symbols found on Canaanite artifacts from the Bronze Age, linking Carthage's religious practices directly back to the older Canaanite world. Inscriptions on those stelae use a specific word, Molech, which has been connected to the biblical term Molech, the deity the Old Testament associates with child sacrifice. Many of the inscriptions follow a repeating formula. A parent identifies themselves by name, states that they made a vow to Baal, and declares that Baal heard their voice. These aren't funeral markers. They're dedicatory inscriptions, the language of fulfilled vows, not the language of grief. Greek and Roman historians describe the practice in vivid detail. Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Carthaginians had a bronze statue of their god with outstretched hands, angled downward, so that children placed on them would roll into a pit of fire below. For decades, modern scholars dismissed these accounts as anti-Carthaginian propaganda. The Romans fought 3 brutal wars against Carthage. Of course, they'd invent the worst possible stories about their enemy. But in 2014, a collaborative study published in the journal Antiquity by researchers from Oxford University and other institutions concluded that the evidence for ritual child sacrifice at Carthage is, in their words, overwhelming. Dr. Josephine Quinn of Oxford stated publicly that the stories were almost certainly true. Dental analysis of the remains showed that the infants died at a specific age range, under 3 months, which was inconsistent with natural infant mortality patterns for the ancient world. The urns contained a mixture of infant and animal remains, suggesting that some parents could substitute a lamb for a child. But here's the detail that chilled me. The proportion of animal substitutes decreased over time. In the oldest archaeological layers, about 30% of the urns contained lamb remains instead of children. In the latest layers, almost all of them contained children. As the centuries passed, fewer and fewer parents chose the substitute. And similar sites, smaller tophets, have been found at other Phoenician colonies in Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. This wasn't unique to Carthage. It was a shared religious custom across the Phoenician world. The Bible itself references this practice multiple times. Deuteronomy 18 forbids making children pass through the fire. Jeremiah 32 condemns those who built altars in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters. The book of Leviticus explicitly prohibits giving children to Molech. And in Jeremiah chapter 7, there's a verse that ties this all together. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger, the Queen of Heaven. Making cakes, pouring out drink offerings. The entire family participating in a ritual that combines the worship of female deity with communal eating of sacred bread and ritual drinks. That phrase, Queen of Heaven, appears again in Jeremiah 44, where the people of Judah defiantly tell the prophet they will continue burning incense and pouring out offerings to her, because when they worshipped her, things went well, and when they stopped, things fell apart. Whoever this Queen of Heaven was, she had followers in Israel itself. And the rituals they performed in her name sound disturbingly familiar. By the time Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the late 4th century, the pagan world it was replacing didn't just disappear. It was absorbed. Deliberately, strategically, and with the full endorsement of church leadership. This wasn't something that happened overnight. For the first 3 centuries after Christ, Christianity existed alongside Rome's pagan religions, sometimes tolerated, sometimes brutally persecuted. But after the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, and especially after Emperor Theodosius made it the official state religion in 380 AD, the question became practical. What do you do with millions of pagans who've been celebrating the same festivals for generations? You don't destroy their customs, you absorb them. Pope Gregory, writing around 600 AD, sent detailed instructions to his missionaries heading to England. His letters survive, and they're remarkably candid. He told them not to destroy pagan temples, but to convert them into churches. Sprinkle them with holy water, he wrote. Set up altars and place relics inside. Because if the people see their familiar places of worship still standing, they will be more willing to come. And he didn't stop at buildings. He told his missionaries that the pagan animal sacrifices should be replaced with Christian feast days so the people could still have their celebrations, just redirected toward the one true God. He even explained his reasoning. It is impossible, he wrote, to cut off everything at once from their rude natures. The man who endeavors to ascend to the highest place rises by degrees or steps, not by leaps. This wasn't a secret conspiracy. It was official, documented church policy. And it wasn't unique to England. Across the Roman world, Christianity absorbed, renamed, and reframed the pagan calendar. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD established that Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. This dating method ensured that Easter would always fall around the same time as Passover, which is historically appropriate since the crucifixion happened during Passover week. But it also meant Easter would always fall around the same time as every spring equinox festival that had been celebrated across the pagan world for millennia. In Rome, the spring festival of Attis and Cybele was celebrated in late March. Worshippers fasted, mourned the death of the young god Attis, and then on the third day celebrated his resurrection with wild rejoicing. The author Alan Watts noted the parallels directly, writing that the members of these cults began a fast shortly before the vernal equinox, just as Christians have the fast of Lent, beginning 40 days before Easter. He added that their universal theme, the drama of death and resurrection, made them the forerunners of the Christian Easter, and thus the first Easter services. Sir James Fraser, in his landmark work, The Golden Bough, went further. He wrote that when we reflect how often the church has skillfully contrived to plant the seeds of the new faith on the old stock of paganism, we may surmise that the Easter celebration of the dead and risen Christ was grafted upon a similar celebration of the dead and risen Adonis. The Anglo-Saxons already had their Eostre celebrations in April. The Romans had their festivals of Attis. The Germanic tribes had their spring rites. When Christianity arrived, it didn't cancel these celebrations. It relabeled them. The egg stayed, the rabbit stayed, the spring timing stayed, the 40-day fast stayed, the name in English and German stayed. What changed was the story being told underneath. Now, whether any of this bothers you depends entirely on what you believe. If you're a devout Christian who views Easter solely as a celebration of Christ's resurrection, you might argue that it doesn't matter where the name came from, just like it doesn't matter that Wednesday is named after the Norse god Woden. The meaning of the day is what counts. And there's a reasonable case for that. If you're a historian, you might find it fascinating that the same death and resurrection narrative appears independently in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Inanna descends and returns. Tammuz dies and returns. Osiris dies and is resurrected by Isis. Adonis is killed and rises again. Persephone descends to the underworld and comes back every spring. Attis dies beneath a pine tree and is reborn on the third day. The pattern is everywhere. And the question of why, whether it's a universal response to the natural cycle of the seasons or something deeper and stranger, is one that no scholar has ever fully answered. And if you're someone who looks at the world through a darker lens, if you're someone who wonders what lurks beneath the surface of the things we've always taken for granted, then you might sit with a different question entirely. The Sumerians carved this story into clay 4,000 years ago. A goddess descends into darkness, dies, and is resurrected. Her lover is dragged into the underworld and returns with the spring. The Babylonians inherited the story. The Egyptians had their own version. The Canaanites did too. And the rituals that surrounded these myths, the 40-day fasts, the eggs as symbols of new life, the worship of a queen of heaven with cakes and drink offerings, those rituals were condemned as abominations in the Old Testament itself. The women weeping for Tammuz at the gates of the temple. The children gathering wood while their mothers kneaded dough for the queen of heaven. The infants passed through fire as offerings to Moloch. And then centuries later, a new religion arose that centered on the death and resurrection of a divine figure in the spring. And that religion absorbed the festivals, the timing, the symbols, and in some cases, even the names of the old ways. Is that a coincidence? Is it simply what happens when new faiths grow in soil already saturated with older beliefs? Or is there something about the human mind, or something about this planet, or something about whatever forces operate beneath the surface of what we call reality that keeps pulling us back to the same story? A god dies, the world goes dark, and then somehow life returns. And here's one more thing that I can't stop thinking about, so I'll leave it with you. The Sumerians identified Inanna with the planet Venus, the morning star and the evening star. And they noticed something about Venus that most people never think about. Venus disappears from the night sky for a period of time, roughly 7 days, when it passes too close to the sun to be visible. Then it reappears on the other horizon. The ancient Mesopotamians watched this happen, and they interpreted it as Inanna's descent to the underworld and her return. The 7 gates she passed through on her way down correspond to the 7 days Venus is invisible. Her stripping at each gate mirrors the star's gradual dimming as it approaches the sun. And her resurrection corresponds to Venus reappearing as the morning star. So the oldest death and resurrection myth we have isn't just a story about crops and seasons. It's written in the sky. Every few months, the planet Venus itself acts out the same narrative: descent, disappearance, return. The Sumerians saw it 4,000 years ago, and they made it the foundation of a religion that would echo through every civilization that followed. The bones in the Tophet of Carthage are real. More than 20,000 urns buried over 6 centuries. The cuneiform tablets are real, preserved in museums around the world, older than the alphabet. The weeping women at the gates of the temple in Ezekiel chapter 8 are in your Bible right now. You can open it and read them. And the word Easter, whether it comes from Eostre or from something older, still is not the word Passover. It never was. I'm not telling you what to think. That's not what this channel does. But the next time you see a child reaching into a basket for a painted egg on Easter morning, or the next time you drive past a church sign advertising their annual Easter egg hunt, just remember this: somewhere under the sand and a rock, there's a clay tablet older than the alphabet. And on that tablet, a goddess descends into the land of the dead and comes back. 4,000 years later, we're still telling the same story. We just forgot where it started. If this one unsettled you, you're not alone. There are layers to history that we're never taught, and sometimes the things hiding in plain sight are the most disturbing of all. If you want to go deeper into the ancient world and the stories that don't get told in Sunday school, the video on screen right now is one you don't want to miss. Subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one.